NASCAR was started in 48, 49, right along in there. My grandfather started in racing late in life. My grandfather is Lee Petty. He was the first three-time champion, first winner of the Daytona 500 at the speedway that we race at now. He didn't always drive a race car. And I like to tell people before he drove a race car, to be politically correct, he was in the beverage transportation business. And it was lucrative. It was a good business. It was a good business. But what he did, he found out in that business, he started working on cars. They started working on cars. They had a trucking company. He started working on cars. And my grandfather grew up at a time and at a place in North Carolina. We're from rural North Carolina, where it was all about getting through the Depression, coming off the Depression, and really just putting food on the table. It was all about money to my grandfather. Everything was about money. It was not about winning races. He would go to the racetrack, and obviously he wanted to win races, but really that's not what it was about. It was about that the winner paid more money. So his point was to win as many races as possible. He had an incredible career in a very short period of time. His career ended at Daytona. In 1961, he and a guy went over the wall, and he spent about 10 or 12 months in the hospital here and never really raced again. He drove a couple of times, but never really raced again. My grandfather won the very first Daytona 500, didn't pick up the trophy for 6 months because he didn't care about the trophy. To him, he could have cared less about the trophy. It was all about going to Daytona and getting that big check and what that meant to his family, to his two sons and his wife. I was 18 years old and wanted to be a race car driver. My mother, I want you to take a good look at me. My mother wanted me to be a pharmacist, okay? Now look at me close. I can see drug dealer, but not pharmacist, okay? So let's be honest, all right? My mother wanted me to be a pharmacist. And so I told her, I said, when I got out of high school, I said, I just wanted to drive a race car. That's all I wanted to do from the time I was 7 or 8 years old. I mean, riding your bike, riding motorcycles, whatever it was, I just imagined myself as being Richard Petty and Cale Yarborough and David Pearson, and I just wanted to be like them because that's who I grew up with. During the summers, from the time I was in the 3rd grade, I would travel with the race team everywhere. And just, we went all over the country, and I just thought there was nothing better than going to a racetrack, than being around race people and going to a racetrack. So when I started racing, I told my father I graduated, and I was working at the shop. I'd been working at the shop forever, it seemed like, and told him I wanted to be a race car driver, and he said, well, if you can get that car ready over there, then we'll go somewhere. So I said, okay. So it was an old Dodge Magnum, and I know y'all don't know what a Dodge Magnum is, but it's as big as this stage, I will tell you that. And my father had switched from Dodges to the GM products in the late 70s. So there was an old Dodge Magnum, so myself and another guy started working on it at night. We got it put together. And I said, okay, where are we going to go? And he said, well, we're going to go test. And I said, well, where are we going to go? And he said, we're going to go to Daytona. And I said, are you kidding me? I mean, going to Daytona for your first test is like flying a jet the first time you get in an airplane to fly something. I had never been in a race car in my life. Never been in a race car in my life. They would just barely let me sit in them, much less drive one around the garage there. But we went to Daytona in '79 and ran an ARCA race, which is a different division than what NASCAR was. And somehow, some way, God protects idiots, because I ended up winning this race. And my second race of my life was a cup race at Talladega. So I went straight from Daytona to Talladega. I ran the first 3 years of my life, or of my career, I ran racetracks no smaller than 1.5 miles. Everything I ran was big racetracks. And in those first 3 years, everywhere I went, I hit a wall. And that's a fact. That's a fact. I didn't have a clue. I was just bouncing off people. But I started in '79, right as my father's career was kind of coming to an end. Even though he drove until '92, he didn't really run that competitive the last 8 or 10 years of his life. But he hung on and he drove a race car for the same reason some of you guys go out and hit golf balls, or some of you guys go hunting, and some of you guys go fishing, because you love it, because you absolutely love it. He never had a hobby. He never had anything else he wanted to do but drive a race car. So to him, to go out on a Sunday afternoon and get in that car and go out and run 500 miles that was like playing around the golf to him. And some days he had good days, and some days he had bad days. But the last 10 years of his career was for him. Not for you guys, not for the sponsors, not for anybody else. It was for him personally. My father started racing in 1958. And when my father started racing, they went to a racetrack, and it was my father, my grandmother, my grandmother, my uncle, and 2 or 3 cousins. That was a race team. In the late 50s, that was what a cup team, what we consider a cup team, was. My grandfather was one of the first guys to race full-time for a living. Most guys that raced through the 50s and even on into the early 60s had a day job, and they just raced on weekends or raced on Friday nights, raced on Saturday nights. But my father and grandfather were in one of their first races, and when the race was over with, they flagged my father to win the winner. He was driving, my father at the time was driving a 57 Oldsmobile. My grandfather was driving a 58 Oldsmobile. And when the race was over with, they flagged my father the winner. He was all excited, thought it was the first time he had ever won a race. My grandmother was all excited. Here's her son, he's won a race. And my grandfather shows up in victory lane and protests and says that my father didn't win the race. Okay? And you could do that back then. And the point of that was that my grandfather was exactly right. He won the race. When they checked the scorecards and they checked the way the race went, my grandfather had won the race. The reason he protested the race was it was 1958. If you won in a current year model car, the promoter paid you $200 more to win in a current year model car than in a year-old car. So the business made $200 more. And my grandfather slept in the guest room for the next week and a half. Okay? Because my grandmother was a little upset about it. I gave this speech the other day to a bunch of rookie drivers over at the Speedway. If you're going to drive a race car, here's what's going to happen. You're going to wreck really hard. And you're going to wreck so hard you don't know where you're at. Okay? That's going to happen to you. Okay? But the other thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to get fired. You're just going to get fired, dude. Most drivers change jobs every 3 years because they get fired. Okay? That's a fact of life. So if you're sitting in a room and you want to be a race car driver and you don't have thick enough skin to take it when you get fired, then you need to go get another job, because chances are you're going to get fired 4 or 5 times, maybe more. When I went to drive for the Wood Brothers, and I would look around the garage at all the guys, and all their last name was Wood and my last name was Petty, I knew when somebody got gone it was going to be me, it wasn't going to be them. So eventually that's what happened. I ended up getting fired up there. I was running second in Indianapolis and blew a tire. You can see this on YouTube. I hit the outside wall, I came back across, and Sterling Marlin was trying to avoid me. He hit me in the left front tire. That knocked me out. I start praying, and I start praying that I'm alive. And, you know, I'm doing pretty good. I'm thinking, okay, if I'm alive, please, God, let me be alive. But I'm not being able to move anything. So then I realized that I must have passed. So I start praying, please, God, when I open my eyes, please let me be standing, you know, at the pearly gates here, because it's going to be important to me long term. So, so I'm like, please let me be standing at the pearly gates. And I don't know how many of you guys know Sterling or have ever heard Sterling Marlin, who used to race on the radio or on TV. But all of a sudden, I start hearing Sterling's voice. I'm coming out of it a little bit more. And I'm praying that if I'm dead, I'm standing at the pearly gates. And then all of a sudden, I hear Sterling's voice, and I put 2 and 2 together. I'm awake enough by now that I put 2 and 2 together, and I realize if I'm dead and if Sterling's there, we ain't in heaven. Okay? Because he was not on that fast track. Okay? So then I go back to praying, please, God, let me be alive. Please just let me be alive. So I begin to wake up a little bit and stirring around in the car, and Sterling's telling them what to do. I mean, he's there. He really helped a lot. I can't even begin to tell you how much he helped. But they had to cut the roof off the car, and at the time, what they would do is they'd cut the roof off the car, and they would put one of those styrofoam neck braces around you, and they'd slide a backboard down the seat. That's the way the race seats were designed. And then they would lift you straight up and lay you on a stretcher. Well, the way I had wrecked and where I ended up, I was up against the inside wall, and they couldn't do anything but cut the top off, so they lifted me out and laid me on the wall, okay? and then they had to drag the car away, and then they brought a stretcher over. But in the meantime, they had picked me up off the wall and laid me flat on the ground. Flat on the ground. So I'm laying on a backboard flat on the asphalt there in Indianapolis. What happens is, then Sterling said, and I'm still in and out of it, because I cracked like 4 vertebrae, broke 6 ribs, dislocated both shoulders, and broke my ankle. So I'm really like in and out of shock. So Sterling said, to finish the story, Sterling said every time they would try to pick me up, that the guys would lean down flat on the asphalt to pick me up and put me up on a stretcher. And he said every time they would pick me up just a little bit, that I would just scream. And he said it was like you were in just blood-curdling scream, like you were in pain. He said they did it twice, and finally the guy that was standing at the head of everything, that was picking me up from the head part, realized that when he had put the neck brace on me and I was laying on the ground, that he was standing on my ponytail every time he tried to pick me up. It's a true story. True story. I started my own team in the late 90s. And I started my own team for one reason, because I had a son that came along and raced, Adam. And my grandfather had given my father a place to race. My father had given me a place to race. And I felt like I owed that to my son, to give him a place to race. So I started my own team. Called it Petty Enterprise 2, PE2. Adam came along, and, you know, it was incredible to go watch him race. I can, looking back, you know, I can imagine what my father thought when I started racing, but to watch your son grow up and to follow in your footsteps and be a part of that was humbling, incredibly humbling to watch him race. He raced ASA. We ran go-karts and late model cars and stuff like that, moved to ASA, ran throughout the Midwest. And it was just amazing. I'll never forget being in California. He called me from Kansas, and he had won his first big race in Kansas, which was huge. We moved up, started running the Nationwide Series in '99, and had a great year. Started 2000, and in 2000, the plan was we were going to run the full Nationwide Series, and then he was going to run some cup races. We were able to race together at Texas Motor Speedway, the only time we ever raced together in a cup race. And that day, he became the first fourth-generation athlete to compete in the same sport that his grandfather, his father, or his great-grandfather, his grandfather, and his father had competed in. That was an incredible day for us. But then just as incredible as that was to watch your son come along and to do that, on May 12th of 2000, he was killed in a practice accident in New Hampshire. The throttle hung on the car, hit the wall, and he didn't wake up. And that is the worst thing. We had been in this sport since 1948. My grandfather had been in incredibly horrific accidents. My father had, I had, but we had all crawled out the window and walked away. And I think we all felt like we always would. But that day it didn't happen. And that totally changed our life. I tell you how my grandfather raced for money. My father raced because he loved the sport. From that point on, I raced for one purpose, and that was to keep Adam's memory alive.